All right, well, welcome to our brave in-person audience and our online audience. My name is Bill Wohlforth. I'm a professor of government in the Department at Dartmouth College, and also the faculty director of Dartmouth's Initiative in Global Security, which is the part of the Dickey Center, which is hosting this event together with the Global Security Institute. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event today. I can't express strongly enough my appreciation to our distinguished guests for coming today. And what you're about to witness is a conversation among three people with extraordinary experience in representing this country in international politics, representing it in international organizations, and in particular, especially to the two of the guests who are arriving today, playing key roles in this country's fateful interaction with the people of Afghanistan. And let me just say a few words, but by way of, I have to pull out my notes here because of the extraordinary nature of the biographies of the people who are sitting before you. But I think in one sense, I hope this isn't taken as offensive because it's meant to be a huge compliment. Sitting on this stage are people representing something like 70 years of combined experience in American foreign relations. The wisdom, the experience, the insight that you have before you, in general, and with respect to Afghanistan, really is difficult to exaggerate. And just a few words on who is sitting before you. Tina Dooley-Jones is sitting closest to me. That would be your stage left. And she's had an extraordinary career in international development, which was capped by posts in what was at the time America's largest development mission in Afghanistan. Finally ending in the early 2020s as the first director of U.S. Agency for International Development's mission in Kabul, Afghanistan. That's following a long and distinguished career in that field. Sitting in the middle chair is Annie. Oh, I should also mention that Tina Dooley-Jones, in addition to her many other accomplishments, holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Dartmouth College. So welcome back. And Andy Pforzhammer is sitting in the middle, a 30-year career involved in the United States Department of State, working in the security, rule of law, human rights, serving as, in three different instances, three different crucial moments in the American experience in Afghanistan, serving in Kabul. Counsel for Political Affairs in 2009 through 2010. From 2017 to 2018, Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul, one of the largest U.S. embassies in the world at the time. And until March 2019, Annie Pforzhammer was the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Afghanistan. Those are just highlights, particularly relevant today, of the career trajectories of these people. And essentially, what we have the benefit of is a wonderful interlocutor for our guests, the director of the Dickey Center, Victoria Holt, herself coming here in fall of this year from being vice president of the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., that following a distinguished career in the Department of State, dealing with international organizations, dealing with peacekeeping, dealing with general issues of high relevance to the topic of conversation today. So what you're about to experience is a conversation among these three experts, which will be followed by open mic time or open email time with the email right here for people to email in any questions that you might have. 35, 40 minutes of conversation, and then we turn it over to the audience. So with that, I will hand things over to Victoria Holt.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, and it's a pleasure to be introduced by you and a pleasure to be here at Dartmouth. By the Dickey Center and our new initiative for global security. So today is a conversation. Many of us experienced the headlines in the news about Afghanistan last summer, as though almost out of nowhere. And yet for 20 years, the U.S. has played and was playing a pivotal role as part of coalition and international activities in Afghanistan. So I'm particularly delighted that Annie and Tina agreed to not only come here, but to discuss their own personal experiences, in part with that sweep of history, discussion of what the goals were, what they thought worked, what they think didn't work, and frankly, where do we go from here? As Bill has pointed out, for those of you not with us today in the room, Please check the email global.security@dartmouth.edu to send in your questions, and we will be turning to this later in the discussion and reading those out loud for our guests here. So before I launch into Afghanistan, it might be worth just briefly talking about your roles in government. You each had multiple decades. Tina, what does a development officer do? Could you briefly talk a bit about what that was?
So USAID is U.S. government's development overseas primary institution. We receive budget from Congress, and we implement all the development projects overseas, which means we go in and we do assessments and ultimately develop a strategy for every country that we're in conjunction with that country. And in Afghanistan, let's say we did kind of the full-fledged development assistance, everything except for, I think, the majorly environment work. We did infrastructure, democracy governance support, health, education are two of our primary initiatives around the world. Health, education, democracy governance, economic growth, agriculture, those types of activities. My role as a mission director is so multi-fascist. It's basically, I'm in charge of, at least in Afghanistan, 250 people, their welfare, their hiring, their retention, their programming, our programming, seeking funds, seeking approval, seeking policy approval, setting strategy at the higher level, setting strategy and approaches at the lower level. And basically what I saw my role, particularly in Afghanistan, in this ever-evolving situation, was trying to empower all staff, Afghan staff, American staff, third country nationals, to be creative and innovative in the way that they think about delivering to the Afghan people or the Afghan government, whoever we're trying to assist. That's a full-time job, and that's a mind drain, as you can imagine, trying to keep everybody motivated, everybody feeling like they're part of a whole, driving towards similar goals, but giving that expression to be creative with, yes, intelligent decision-making, but if you fail, you learn from it, and we get up and we do something else. Afghanistan is a country that didn't have a problem with budget, ever, in terms of development assistance. So using it wisely can be very, very important, and using their innovation and creativity was part of my role is pulling that out of people.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Annie, is there a simple way to explain what being a career foreign service officer and minister counselor means?
Foreign service officers work in a variety of areas. They could specialize in economics, for example. They could specialize in consular work, which are visas or helping Americans overseas. My specialty was political affairs. So all the way through, from junior up to more senior positions, I focused on the political dynamics of the country that I was in, the goals that the United States had with that country. For example, when I was in Turkey, we had a number of security goals, human rights goals there. And my job was to report back to the United States as honestly as I could the dynamics of that country and also how they were responding to our agenda. And I had to be the deliverer of our agenda, the person who said to a government, we're unhappy with your decisions, or could you please help us in this other area? To be the rank that I was reflected having gone to a point of a lot of responsibility. And as the number 2 at the embassy in Kabul, I had a lot of these challenges that Tina's talking about, which is you can't do these things yourself. What you need is to motivate your staff and let them know what the mission is. We've talked a lot about that. We can talk more, that giving people a very clear sense of the goal is one way to make sure that people are pulling together. And we had to keep people safe under very adverse situation, a very adverse environment. But safe didn't just mean staying at home. We had to find ways for people to get out as much as possible, while still keeping the risk to them manageable. So it's responsibility and also reporting.
Yeah, fantastic. well, maybe we come back to your careers in the discussion period. I know you both served on multiple continents, in the field, in Washington, at the White House, in all kinds of roles. So we'll
Yeah.
discuss that. So let's go back in time for a moment before we get to where we are today and where do we go. Annie, you had a really interesting time. You first served in Afghanistan in the early days of the Obama administration. And then you fast forwarded after multiple other postings to come back. And somewhere in between there, as I mentioned in the beginning, when 9/11 had struck, you could imagine most Americans knew that we were responding to a terrorist attack on the United States. We built a coalition supported by the Security Council and allies around the world. And the goal in great part was counterterrorism. And then we added, I think, governance and human rights and the rights of women and regional stability and security. And I could be wrong, and you can correct me. But I'm wondering, by the time you got there, if you contrast, what were the sort of goals of the Obama administration? And were they the same or different under Trump? And did you think that those were the right goals for what you were seeing?
Thank you. You're absolutely right. There were multiple goals, and clearly that was an issue when it came to giving the American people the best possible idea of what we were doing and why we were doing it. But after that sort of initial consensus of going into Afghanistan came the period of time where two things happened. One was that the United States decided to go into Iraq, which drew a lot of attention and even resources away from the effort in Afghanistan. And there was also this sense that it had been so easy that it would remain easy. And so the first part of the war was essentially trying to do this a little on the cheap with as few people as possible. The main effort would be Iraq. And the Taliban, who had been pretty shocked by the ease with which the United States arrived, began to come back and began to form a threat to the government, which was at that point only barely out of its period of civil war and complete disarray. So what were our goals at that point? We thought we had already achieved them. We thought we had a stable government that wasn't being threatened. We would work with them. We would build them up a little bit. Certainly women's rights showed up as a U.S. goal from the start. You know, Laura Bush and others saw this as one of the most important achievements of what we had already done. Well, it got harder and harder to hold on to what we had done. And so by the end of the Bush administration, the question arose, how much more fighting would the United States have to do to allow this government to essentially begin to form itself and really become this stable partner, not just something we were propping up entirely. So when the Obama administration started, and that's when I first arrived, there was an almost 6-month-long strategy review. And I participated in it. And as Tina has pointed out separately, when Washington does a strategy review and Afghanistan is 9 hours away, sometimes you're there at midnight and trying to, participate in something. At the end of the strategy review, the ambassador, with the help of a number of us at the embassy, wrote a very secret message back to Washington and said, I don't think that a surge in troops is a good idea. We don't have a reliable partner, they're not legitimate enough, and we should not be putting ourselves into the position where we're going to put a lot more Americans in harm's way. That cable was leaked to the New York Times, which was a big problem. It was also not heeded. So President Obama decided to surge the amount of troops. He essentially made the worst policy decision he possibly could have. They surged the troops, and at the same time, they announced the deadline for how long the troops would be in country. So from 2011 through 2013 or 14, this was the surge and then the withdrawal. And the Taliban very naturally was emboldened by this. So you started to see even more fighting. And that was something that the Obama administration honestly did not have a response to, except to keep doing what they've been doing. In about 2015, we moved over to moving back from a combat role and being in support of the Afghans. So during that whole time, the Afghan military had been building up to the point where they were able to take the lead on combat operations. And at the end of the Obama administration, when faced with the idea that he would fully withdraw, he decided not to do so and let the following president make the decision. And that was when I returned the first year of the Trump administration. They actually decided two things: that the end result should be a political settlement. We were no longer talking about a military victory. And that they would leave aside conditions and they would stay until a political settlement was reached. That lasted a year. And that policy gave way to the one that led to the end game, which was, we're going to have a negotiation, and essentially we're going to set a deadline on ourselves. So it doesn't really sound linear, because it was not. American politics had a lot to do with where we were at every given moment. But did we have a goal? In essence, yes, we had a goal, which was we wanted to leave and not have to return. And the only way to do that was to have a government that was capable of maintaining its own security.
That's a very complex picture that you paint in a very short piece. I may come back to you. I'm going to turn to Tina in a moment, but I think was the overarching goal, think about this for our future, was it peace, was it stability, was it counterterrorism, and even in the confusion, I'd be interested in, as we keep going, where you think those overarching goals landed in that process. But just as you were leaving Afghanistan, I think Tina was joining the Kabul mission, first as the deputy mission director, and then as the director, as Bill has pointed out, of the largest AID mission in the world. I think you had over 250 people. I'm not even sure what your budget was. So let me ask you the same question, picking up for where Annie was. What did you see as not just the goals of the US, but your goals at AID? I think you were also there during the efforts at peace, an outbreak of COVID, and then the decision to withdraw. So maybe you could walk us through, again, what were those goals? What did you think was working and not?
So I think the goals, and USAID works within it is the part of the foreign policy apparatus of the US. People talk about the 3Ds, diplomacy, defense, and development, and I think those three still work together. And I'll talk, when I talk about the Afghanistan Coordination Task Force, it was those three department agencies that needed to work together on anything in Afghanistan. When I first got there, it was within months of Annie leaving, administration, policy towards Afghanistan, the discussions between Ambassador Khalilzad and the Taliban were ongoing. There's supposed to be a start of negotiations coming soon. And we started to plan for that. While we had a brand new 5-year strategy that had been developed in 2018 for Afghanistan, it actually didn't mention, I think it mentioned twice, it had the word peace in that strategy. So it was like a normal generic strategy. So it's like, how do we infuse this potential for peace, but also the support to move towards peace if it happens, support that movement, that progression. So we started challenging staff, the offices in different ways to come up with how can you support peace process, but also how can you continue your work, and if peace breaks out, we used to talk about breaking out in Afghanistan, what's the programming, how does it evolve again after that point? So, fast forward through support for the peace process, support to Ambassador Khalilzad's team, and he came out many, many times to Afghanistan, and we actually seconded people to his team, and there was a peace and reconciliation section created in the embassy, and we had full membership on it, and we're asked to do a lot of different things. Our democracy governance program was doing a lot of research. We funded a lot of the research that USIP did. So that just kept going and going. At the same time, there was an assistance review of Afghanistan by the State Department, which was based on some of the back and forth that went between the two presidents, and forced us to reduce staffing and forced us to reduce a little bit our budgets. And then that went on, and there was a pledging conference on Afghanistan, the Geneva Conference in November of 2020, which was tough because the Afghan government wasn't doing exactly what we needed them to do in terms of their engagement politically amongst themselves, coming together with one voice at the talks and engaging effectively in the peace talks. Getting through that, and then going on to March 2021, when COVID came with a vengeance. Well, that was 2020. Came on with a vengeance and stopped most of our programs. We had to support the health system in any way that we could with, you name it, training new protocols, supplies, oxygen plants, vaccines, you name it. Education fell apart, so alternative remote education became a thing. We had to support that as well. Just governance structures, they couldn't meet. So how does that continue to engage civil society in decisions that the government definitely had to make, right, going forward? Production on agriculture, trade came to a close because borders became not, weren't open anymore. And then you just kept going on through COVID, and we changed our programs. We pivoted certain programs to try to kickstart certain things in agriculture, health, and other things, which worked fairly well. And we were positioned fairly well. And then you get to fast forward into the Biden administration coming in, and that period of time where you didn't know what decisions would make, and what's the timing of those decisions. And the timing kept changing a little bit over that month or two. And then September 11th was announced as the withdrawal date. But as soon as the Biden administration came in, under Trump, the interagency policy didn't operate. Basically didn't operate. Very, very little engagement. These meetings didn't take place. As soon as Biden came in, there were dozens a week on Afghanistan. I'm not joking. And the scenario planning was crazy. Every agency, every department had their own scenario planning, own timeline, own objectives, but it was all pulled together. And the NSC forced us to pull it all together in cohesiveness.
What scenarios were you planning for?
We were planning for a partially good outcome where an interim government, joint interim government would come together. We were planning for the Taliban will continue to try to, their insurgency, but it's within, it's contained somehow. We were planning for ultimately the complete collapse of the government, Taliban complete takeover, which is what it came to. But what was the problem was, under each of them, when we had objectives, right? And for USAID, the last objective was, on that worst case scenario was, we provide humanitarian assistance for as long as we can, as long as security situation allows those humanitarian actors to be secure in the delivery. That was it.
Okay.
No discussion of economic collapse, of food insecurity. We all knew the drought was coming. We all knew that COVID had already, damaged these supply chains and everything else. We all knew it was coming, but that was not in the discussion. It wasn't in the plans whatsoever. We hadn't planned for a bad outcome in terms of our own staffing, in terms of our own programming, but not in terms of the fallout on the Afghan people. So, I left I left Kabul in the middle of July, and I retired at the end of September. And before then, I'm still on call to USAID, and I got a call in like the third week of August, saying USAID needs a senior representative on the Afghanistan Coordination Task Force in Washington, a state-led DoD USAID task force. I spent 5 weeks on there trying to help the team in Kabul with the evacuation, and when that came to an end, very late their night on August 30th, we turned our attention to moving literally those 70,000 people through the lily pad system and into the US and onward, but also continuing trying to get people out as backdoor negotiations kept going with the Taliban in terms of the safe security of those operations.
So you describe a process of at least scenarios potentially anticipating a not successful U.S. withdrawal in the sense that the Taliban not only continued to challenge, but then overtook the government. We saw the president flee, and we saw many Afghans trying to flee as the U.S. was pulling out. So it'd be interesting to know the task force then kicked in after that started to try and help Afghans out and help Americans and other expats out. Is that what you're describing? All right. Meanwhile, Annie, rather than resting on her retirement with some cozy vacation, at least on a full-time basis, you, for the first time, I think, in your life as a civilian, started speaking out. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were seeing and what you were concerned about, and what you were arguing, which was neither stay and do what we've been doing or pull out fully? You, as I've read, you tried to create a different space. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Thank you. Personally, I retired in March of 2019. And even before then, I was in contact with some people who had formed a group actually back in 2013 called Alliance in Support of the Afghan People. And they had been former US officials who were arguing against, a precipitous pullout. So they reformed this group, and I joined it as soon as I retired. When you're in the government, you really have restrictions on what you can do and say publicly. But having left, I didn't have those. And we started publishing articles and trying to talk to administration and congressional officials about the danger of seeing this binary choice, that you either were going to stay, quote unquote, at war, putting lots of US soldiers in harm's way, or you take everybody out. And, I know a lot of people understood there were nuances, but unfortunately, by the time that argument reached, the general public, it almost sounded like those were the two options being discussed. And of course, it was an election year. This was something people wanted to just say quickly. I wouldn't leave our troops in harm's way in a war. I would take everybody out. So we kept trying to push exactly that, a middle ground, a third option, the idea of principled US engagement and principled disengagement. If we're going to leave, that's fine. That's a good policy choice. But the way that you do it matters. And what you're trying to leave behind really matters. And that's not just because we're, our big hearts and we feel sorry for people, et cetera. We actually believe very strongly that that's in the US security interest. It's an important region to us, and our international reputation and how we are perceived as allies is important to us around the rest of the world.
So implied in both of those, you thought we were doing some good, as well as there's been great critiques of the development effort, the governance effort, and the amount of money put into it. And there's also been an argument that the US perhaps lost some of its way on its larger goals. So just as a move into the next section here and thinking about where we are today, it's pretty tough to read in the news. I think the Secretary General just announced last week the largest request for humanitarian aid in its history for Afghanistan for a single country, $5 billion. And while the US has pledged, I think, over $300 million towards that, reporting shows that's less than what we were spending on humanitarian aid there last year. They're also warning that somewhere between half and all Afghanis will be affected by the famine that you described, Tina, at least some level of food insecurity and poverty. And that's before you get to the question of governance or the rights of the Afghan people, including women and girls. So this is a pretty tough question. Where should we go now? Where would you, given what's going on, where would you put your efforts, and where would you say the US should put its efforts?
Which of us gets that?
I'm looking for eyebrows lifting up. Either of you want to try that first? Tina, since it's a bit in the humanitarian space?
Yeah.
What do you think about that kind of huge call for humanitarian assistance? And maybe just to add, those are some of your former partners with the United Nations and all its agencies, with other Afghan organizations and NGOs, is my understanding.
Right. This crisis, the current crisis, the humanitarian appeal, it happens every single year, right? we knew this was coming. They cited 18.5 million people at risk for food insecurity a year ago. They knew the famine, the food insecurity, the production, the drought, the lack of trading, the lack of liquidity, the lack of livelihoods in order to afford food if you can't grow it. We knew that this was coming. So I think what's next is trying to get through this current crisis, but knowing that it's a crisis that's going to continue to evolve. I think what we have to do is, and one thing that would help dramatically is the efficient use of a $5 billion potential appeal budget for humanitarian assistance. And there are a couple of things which are stopping it. I think there's been a very good channel between the UN system and the Taliban, the TPC in Doha. They understand the 4 principles of humanitarian assistance, and they accept them kind of as a code of conduct, the Taliban do. And so they've worked out no taxation, no interference, no beneficiary interference, selection interference, none of that. So they've worked that out. But what is causing the inefficiencies is the lack of a domestic financial and international financial channel to move those funds efficiently. To be able to buy the food which is in the markets locally is a lot less expensive than trying to take it out of warehouses and fly it into Kabul and then distribute it. Same thing with medicines, the same thing with other supplies. So try to fix that problem. And no, I agree with Annie, it's not the $7 billion that we have here in this country. $5 billion in appeal, used effectively, will get there. It will have an impact. I think also if that agreement holds on the humanitarian side, we could try to push those same types of codes, principles into developing livelihoods, agriculture. We're seeing a kind of a low-level resurgence of the private sector in Afghanistan as well. But also, on the flip side, is to continue to pressure diplomatically on the human rights, on women's and girls, on the marginalized populations, abuses, and those types of things.
All right, thanks. And I want to maybe steer you more towards the security and the political a bit. Are you worried about a return of extremist forces, including a version of ISIS or ISIL? Are you worried about governance? What kind of political arrangements could be made? What would you say, and I think to quote you, we can't turn our backs. The United States has left the country, but we can't, for moral and strategic reasons, turn our backs on Afghanistan.
Well, I think that it's not unrelated to trying to address the humanitarian crisis right now. I mean, that's leading to an enormous amount of disruption, possible flows of refugees. These are all things that can also destabilize the security situation. I think that the United States has to stop acting alone. We should multilateralize what we're doing in every way. Using the UN, a very imperfect instrument on its political side, is still essential because the message from the so-called Western donor nations is one thing, but when it comes from all of the Security Council members, the Taliban are actually paying attention. They want to be seated at the UN. That's one of the few tools that we have left, is that form of legitimacy. And they actually do care what Russia and China will say to them. So we're trying to, I think what we should be trying to do rather is work for a conclusive international message to the Taliban about a roadmap towards more normalized relations. They were very good at their negotiating strategy. They wanted, 5 things, and they just said, these are what they wanted, what we want, and they didn't really deviate. We have to actually take a page from that strategy. What do we want? We want every child to go to school when it starts in March. I mean, should the donor community be paying for an apartheid school system? I don't think so. I think we have to be very clear on our red lines. We want every child to start school. We want to end the reprisal killings that are happening of former government officials or activists or journalists. We want women's rights, the right to actually leave their homes and earn a living. And the international community might hold out some inducements with the Taliban changing. a lot of people who know the Taliban style very well will say they're never going to do it, but that's a stalemate that they're choosing. The other thing I think we should be looking at, as Tina noted, is the private sector. Are there ways that we can safely get more liquidity into the private sector, right? Rather than having all of these functions go through the government, can the private sector be something of a counterbalance? Afghans need to be able to earn a living. So we push the humanitarian and humanitarian plus sort of quasi-development funding out through non-governmental means. We empower the private sector, and we make our human rights and normalization and counterterrorism agenda crystal clear. And I think those are the only steps available.
All right. Well, thank you both. You've really walked us through a lot. Let me look at the audience and to look at my good colleague, Tom Candon, to see if there's any questions that have been coming into us from our audience outside this room.
We do have a couple questions online here. So the first one I'll read is from Jay Rosenberg, class of '82, Committee for Humanitarian Assistance to Afghanistan. And he asks, what in your minds is the single most determinative factor preventing vital humanitarian assistance from reaching Afghan citizens this winter, which threatens the very lives of 1 million children?
Okay. Tina or Amy, Annie, either of you?
I think I partially alluded to that. I think it's the will is there. I think the structures are there. I think the agreement with the Taliban is there in terms of the delivery of that assistance. Even before the withdrawal, UNAMA had started to, basically at our request, to start pre-positioning supplies, food, and other things, getting ready, as they always do, for the winter season, the lean season and the winter season. And so it just needs a massive ramp up in terms of scale. I think the other thing is this domestic, the finance issue, to move that money into the country and use it effectively, just even to pay staff. I think everything is there. It's just the will to do it. We have lost time, and unfortunately, a regrettably large portion of the country will not survive this winter. We've lost too much time.
Tom, do you want to ask another question?
I can bring another one from the emails we've been getting here. This next one is from Dr. Mordecai Kadar at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, Bar Ilan University in Israel. He says, in 2010, I met with one of the late Richard Holbrooke's staff and gave him a paper about the benefit of dividing Afghanistan to some 9 ethnic states, Pashtun, Hazara, etc., something like what happened with the Soviet Union. Was this idea ever discussed seriously?
I think that maybe not 9, but there have been discussions over time about whether Afghanistan can survive as a unitary state. And every Afghan I ever spoke to would have pushed back entirely on that issue. Who knows right now how people are feeling, but the overwhelming political sense I had from talking to government officials and non-governmental and business people, civil society, was that they might disagree on almost everything else, but they approved of their constitution and they approved of their country as a single country. The flag is this hugely emotional touchstone for Afghans that I know. And so in the end, and cities, the urbanized Afghanistan has become much more mixed. I don't think that you would have an easy time dividing it ethnically. I mean, the ethnic groups are there, and they are an important distinction of Afghanistan's political and social life. But it's not that evenly divided, a Yugoslavia, for example, and I don't think that that idea ever gained traction.
Go ahead, Tom, one more from you, and then I'm happy to turn to some of our colleagues here in the audience as well.
Okay. I'll keep going. This one's from a class of 25, Madeline Shaw, who asks two questions. What does the U.S.'s departure from Afghanistan and current negligence of human rights atrocities tell us about its future foreign policy commitments? And two, what do you see as the path to the Taliban's recognition as the legitimate governing body of Afghanistan?
Those are two great questions.
Well,
Annie, you want to start off? Yeah.
Sure. With the second question, the word legitimate is in there. I mean, what is a legitimizing process that the Taliban could subject itself to? It exists. A coup government, a government that takes over by force, could turn itself into a government which subjects itself to an election process, or in Afghanistan's context, a jirga, a shura, a conference, some kind of gathering where people give their assent, where they're allowed to voice their opinions, and then come up with some kind of decision. If the Taliban actually wanted to go through a process like that, we might be dealing with a normalization process on the international arena that could be in terms of months and not years. But if they continue as they have done, and as they pretty much are promising to do, which is to assert that they have won through force of arms, and that's legitimacy enough, then I don't see them gaining some kind of international legitimacy. They can go on for years like this, and the international community is not obliged to recognize them.
Tom, what was the first part of that question as well?
Sure. The first one was, what does the U.S.'s departure from Afghanistan and current negligence of human rights atrocities tell us about its future foreign policy commitments?
You want to go for that?
In a sense, it's a stark question about what the U.S. role in the world will be in the future, and to what do we take action. You both, though, have also talked about sort of a nuanced, it's not an on-off switch, in or out. As diplomat, as a development expert, I think you've had careers where you've been in places that are not in the news. So perhaps to augment, Tom, that question, which is, particularly to Afghanistan, what do we do in the light of potential atrocities that are ongoing? But what's your vision also for the larger U.S. role in the world? Yes, with military, but also often with the civilian side of our power.
I think what I've seen in Afghanistan in my 2.5 years there and in other countries is having a very clear foreign policy, having a very clear set of objectives and end state vision is necessary. If you don't have that, and the objectives in Afghanistan changed, I don't think we ever had truly an end state vision. What do we want to see in Afghanistan? Even with the Islamic Republic, that administration, we never had it. I think that's very important to determine, to, I guess, highlight what we believe our role in the world should be. I would argue that it's not just national security and a counterterrorism role in Afghanistan. We are a very generous, global society with interests, with compassion on human rights abuses, on the role of women and girls in society, and that we want to build good partners. That, to me, is our broader role. It's just what rings in everybody's mind is, as soon as they heard the word national security or war, they're focused there in terms of global issues.
Yeah.
They don't think about our broader responsibilities as a world power to the globe.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to you, Annie, but we've all had the pleasure of being squeezed into very small rooms at the National Security Council to make decisions in under an hour of huge consequence. But in doing that, you see the power of the U.S. government, the interagency, and that natural partnership. And perhaps part of what's missing is an American understanding of all those tools that we bring to bear. But say, Annie, you're in that place where you have to design the strategy. How would you think about this for going forward for our role in the world? For U.S. involvement?
We have a credibility problem. And it is in part because, as Tina's pointed out and others, that if you don't know what you want, it's hard to get, to sell it, to get the American people to come on board with you. We had, let's say, a Cold War strategy for 60, 70 years that was broadly understood. I mean, it was partly based on fear, but it had a lot to do with some of the most important values that Americans held about their own system of government and way of life. I don't think that's been substituted with some other kind of world mission that people buy into. I would like to believe, as Tina says exactly, we are a global power with morals and with a sense of right and wrong, and it is good for us to be in solidarity with powerless people who need help, who are being, horrifically oppressed. If that solidarity is just words, that's still something. If it can be pressure that's brought to bear on a government that's oppressing those people, even better. I believe that because I believe that's integral to who we are as Americans. But I also understand that's not how most Americans feel right now. And perhaps it's because they conflate that sense of mission with going to war. Well, there are many, many ways that we can be active, moral participants in the world without having to use our military. And I guess we really have to communicate that, and we have to relearn those tools that are short of military force.
Thank you. I see some very learned people in the audience. I don't know, John, Bill, one of you, one of our postdocs, like to jump in here.
Thanks, first of all, for your comments today. Really appreciate you being here. So I'm thinking about, the goal of establishing an Afghan government that secured buy-in from the Afghan people. And maybe that was the sort of central goal over the last couple of decades in the country. And I appreciate that you guys weren't there for the whole sweep, but I'm going to ask you to kind of think about the whole sweep of a couple of decades. And in retrospect, watching what happened last summer, I think it's easy for people to say that goal was doomed from the start. It was never. But I want to ask you to kind of revisit that and think about, these 20 years and comment, if you can, were there any moments where that goal of sort of establishing a government that secured real buy-in among Afghans was kind of more realizable or less realizable? And then sort of second to that, were there actions that the U.S. could have taken in its role to have pushed things in a different course? I realize this is a question you could probably take 72 hours or so to answer, but in the time we've got.
Thanks, John.
So I personally, I would say, bang my head against the wall repeatedly for, just for hours on Afghanistan's elections. I was there in 2009, and I was there when they were preparing for parliamentary elections in 2018. And, election preparation, on the one hand, is kind of simple, but on the other, it's 1,000 details. And there were a lot of bad actors within the Afghan polity who were trying to, steal the election ahead of time. And it was so frustrating because it was their best and most visible manifestation of how does a government get legitimacy. I mean, the Jirgas were good, but it's a big country. To rule 35 million people, you can't really meet everybody personally. So having an election was at least another way to legitimize them. And I think the biggest lost opportunity, and Americans tried so hard on this, was 2014, was the election which was the transition from Karzai to Ghani. And among other things would have been, sort of was, I think the first ever peaceful transition between two Afghan leaders through an election, or maybe even just the first peaceful transition between two leaders. And it was a huge moment, and they blew it. And the people involved in that election who conducted fraud, that was part of the disintegration of American officials' commitment to Afghanistan, was right there. But I do think that on a different level, I will give one area of hope. When I was there in 2017-18, the Civil Service Commission put out their exam for teacher positions. And for the first time, people from anywhere at all, related to nobody, were able to take an exam and get a government position based on merit, which just takes a really long time to build that kind of system. But that's what democracies could be based on, and legitimacy.
Fantastic, thank you. Tina, anything to add to that?
All I would say is I can't find a defining moment in my time there where there was any gain in legitimacy or potential. I just saw a real decline in that legitimacy. While I truly don't believe Ghani is corrupt, I think he, for various reasons, to stay in power and to try to continue to be relevant in the country, he joined forces with some pretty bad actors who were corrupt. And it was a uneasy situation for him, very lucrative for those he joined forces with. But it just started to unravel through various layers of government, and that corruption became endemic to the lowest levels, as you know. I always have said, actually, this is one of the questions I asked a researcher once was, tell me what percentage of the development dollar goes towards corruption that we won't even, we don't want, nobody wants to talk about that. If we got rid of corruption, we would get rid of a 40% loss, minimum 40% loss in a development dollar. And these are development dollars, we don't even know where the corrupt act is taking place to divert these funds. So I don't think the legitimacy, I don't think there was a point in time there might have been many points in time where there was an opportunity to build legitimacy, but I never saw it in my time there.
Thank you. Tom, I think you signaled we have another question.
We do. There are a couple built up. This one is, and I apologize if I mispronounce the name. I think Tori will be able to correct me. Alina Tori-John. Question 1. Many international delegations have met with the Taliban without any women among them. Can women's rights, and specifically their right to access to education, be discussed in a meaningful way in such conversation while excluding women? And 2, over the last 2 decades, the US and other members of NATO have invoked the rights of Afghan women and girls to help justify their military engagement in Afghanistan. Does the responsibility of these nations to promote and protect these rights end with the troop withdrawal?
Those are 2 great questions. And I know the person asking the question is herself from Afghanistan and a refugee here in the United States. Annie, do you want to start on that?
Sure, I think both questions very clearly, women should be part of delegations meeting with the Taliban. I know, male former colleagues in the State Department are perfectly capable and willing to say the words, but it's a different message. I think with respect to the NATO nations, ouch, that's an excellent point, because in Europe, in particular, the mission, and Canada, the mission of helping women was very much part of what was, told to the population to help justify the NATO mission. And they did put their money where their mouth was. There was a lot of money from those countries to help women. Canada's entire aid budget was focused on women. And Canada has stepped up to offer asylum to a lot of the women activists, people that the United States is not helping, Canada is helping. And I guess I think they should all, and Germany, by the way, is also doing a lot of the same very quiet asylum work. But the big point is correct. Nobody should be allowing these human rights abuses to continue without speaking up and trying, as I said before, to have a coordinated, powerful international message of this is what we need.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we funded a lot of, every single one of our programs had gender, women, girls imbued within as part of the strategy. the inclusion of women in the negotiations. We were helping women's alliances and organizations networks in Afghanistan develop position papers, being ready to get to the negotiating table, trying to get to Turkey. That was all set with the papers in hand. One of the problems was different members had totally different asks, totally different demands in some instances. It's the same problem we have with the Ghani government, right? With Abdullah and Ghani and various other factions, trying to get them to come to one set of requirements or red lines or demands or whatever it is. It was very difficult. The other thing that I would say, and I said this multiple times to the NSC, to my own leadership, we should not be promising what we cannot deliver in terms of women and protecting women and girls, in terms of making sure that they are included in the Taliban's anything, particularly post-withdrawal. Even before withdrawal, I was on multiple panels and multiple conferences, Zooms and webinars, you name it, where I would hear US officials, rallying the cry for women and girls and promising things, and I said, stop promising. You're giving them false hope. What can we do when we're out of the country? What can we do when we can't actually do development work because of sanctions? We cannot assist them. We could barely assist them to get out of the country. There are certain few, and these are mostly, I hate to say it, the elites. A lot of these women, the leaders of these alliances and networks are elites. That I think was a problem, particularly post-withdrawal, is an outcry for the international community to continue to come to the aid. But we hadn't figured out how to continue to deliver that.
I think we're hearing a theme: deliver on what you promise. Tom, how about one more, and then we'll turn to wrapping up with final remarks after this question.
Well, I think you may have answered this already, but this comes from Anant Shukla, who is an OFS veteran 2019. It says, thank you for your time and perspectives. While Afghanistan has been described as a prototypical example of mission creep to many, especially in the military community, do you feel that now that our efforts to build a democracy in Afghanistan have failed, should we have a singular focus in supporting the national resistance through covert operations to ensure the Taliban don't succeed and hopefully collapse at the expense of likely large-scale humanitarian disaster?
Go, please.
I haven't personally been in favor of that option, and not because, in my heart of hearts, it would be lovely to have the story go that way, right? That there was a national resistance and the Taliban was brought down. That would be, I would like to see that. But this is really not human-centered policymaking, right? The humans in Afghanistan need there to be an end to war. And everything about the delivery of assistance and the restarting of the economy needs the war to stop. So if there's going to be resistance, and I hope that there is plenty of it eventually, it has to be channeled in ways that are nonviolent and that don't cause more collateral damage to more citizens. That's my prayer. But yeah, the idea of sort of covert operations, chapter 5 of our engagement, I think that's not a positive one.
I think we're just well past that question period. It's not going to happen. We're out, and we're not going to. There has been no resistance mounted in the last 4 months. Not in the.
Well, they're still asking.
They're still asking. No, they're asking. There is nonviolent resistance, obviously, but in terms of a military intervention, it's not going to happen. I'll stop there.
So if you do imagine peace, you both talked about how the negotiations were just with the Taliban, which the US was leading, which didn't involve the Afghan government. There's also been a lot of concern about the region, the role of Pakistan, the role potentially of China, India, and other countries. So maybe in a final question of like, what's that mix today? How would a peace get worked out? Is it not negotiated? Is it something that just creates relationships over time? What do you imagine the region looks like in the next 5 years, and what can the U.S. do to shape that?
I think, unfortunately, the region, the Afghan neighbors in particular, have shown a pretty high tolerance for allowing Afghanistan to be either chaotic or suffering. They have hardened their borders, they're not interested in refugees, and they are not necessarily lending enough energy to the concept of peace or a more, inclusive government. The Iranian government is saying a lot of the right things. China and Russia at least have signed on to certain aspects of UN policy which are positive. But if there's going to be some kind of, conference, peace conference, hopefully it will happen in the region and it will happen soon. And I'm not personally seeing that. The U.S. really is relegated at this point to being a major donor, but we're not going to be the ones who manage peace. We could not even do it when we had genuine influence in the country, so we're certainly not going to be able to do it now. That's why I was saying we have to multilateralize as the U.S. our ambitions. We have to try to find UN or regional bodies that are going to work with the Taliban and try to bring them to that better observance of human rights that will allow us to move forward to some slightly more normal relations. Otherwise, we're really on a kind of intravenous drip of humanitarian assistance until the Afghans, I'm really not sure until what, until they come up with their own source of funds or until the Afghans themselves say this is our legitimate government and we'd like it to be accepted by the world.
Yeah, thank you. Tina?
Yeah, I
additional
just don't
thoughts?
think that the neighborhood has never been friendly to Afghanistan. I think they've always looked at Afghanistan in terms of their own internal interests, domestic interests, Pakistan in particular, playing the multiple games, and Iran back and forth in terms of their support or lack of support. And the other countries, I know there was a very big push by the State Department, and we supported it, for interconnectivity between the region, flowing through Afghanistan, economic, and we were ready to support economic development between them, connectivity, social, health, you name it, along the borders and through those borders. But it didn't garner enough interest.
Yeah.
There was domestic politics, there were regional, there were also cultural, tribal things going on across those borders that didn't go anywhere. So I don't think, but I also I think we need to define peace. Peace in some people's mind is a lack of violence. Some people that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So what are we looking for in terms of getting to peace for Afghanistan? Is it an Afghanistan at peace with itself?
Yeah.
Or whatever that form that takes? Or is it a peace that we can accept, the international community?
And you did mention the terrorism problem. I mean, even now, it's not will it return? It has returned. There are emboldened terrorist groups that have now in Afghanistan and have no issues with the government. So will they become international threats? That's another question. But we definitely do have a country that is a hospitable environment for terrorism.
Well, I think you've set us up well for future conversations, not just the U.S. role in the world, but what we do in Afghanistan and what we do around that area, as well as, Tina, your challenge on defining peace beyond the lack of violence. I know we have people here at Dartmouth who could engage you on that. I did want to end on a couple of useful notes. You've both described careers that are deep and rich and thoughtful, and we only talked about them in Afghanistan. So I think it's a really interesting story you tell about what it's like to try and work on behalf of the United States, its values, its interests, its security goals. And I will also note that earlier today you mentioned that one of your hopes were based on the youth and the younger people of Afghanistan, who for the last 20 years have experienced a slightly different version. They may have much higher expectations and access to education. And the recent news says that we here in the Upper Valley will actually be welcoming people from Afghanistan, including here at Dartmouth. So maybe we could have you back for a conversation, not just with them, with this larger community. But I just really want to thank you for walking us through your story and giving us some real genuine insights into the challenges that you face in Afghanistan and we as a nation will be asking ourselves for the future. So please join me in thanking our fantastic guests.
Thank you.